There's something about pictures. Pictures go straight into your brain. You can't block them, right through your eyes. You see it, you can't unsee it. That's a quote from Art Spiegelman, author of Mouse, and that's one of the books I'm going to talk about today. That's not from the book itself, but that's something that he had to bring up in answer basically to why this book, which I was surprised to find out. I didn't realize until after I read it and dig into all this that it's been published since 1986, and yet just a couple of years ago in 2022, it started getting challenged, was outlawed in a Tennessee school district, followed, of course, by Florida and Texas, and then Missouri, and then several others. And now it's just on the list of one of the most banned books across school districts. And so I'm going to talk about why this particular book, as well as a couple of other graphic novels, are being banned. Before I delve into the books themselves, let's just get to the heart of the matter. So comics should be for kids, right? They should be funny. They should be lighthearted. They shouldn't talk about serious topics. They should definitely not have anything involving, adult themes. Okay, that's what people who have never actually read graphic novels or don't know what they're about would say. That's the knee-jerk reaction for these people who try to ban or outlaw some of these books. But not only does it show an ignorance on the format itself, it goes deeper than that. And once you see these books I'm going to discuss today, you'll see there are very specific reasons, underlying reasons, why these books are being challenged and not other graphic novels. So let's start with, I guess you could say, the most notorious of those graphic novels that are banned. It's Mouse. And interestingly enough, this is also not as straightforward as you would think. This isn't just a book that came out a while ago. This was a series of comics that Art Spiegelman did, and they were actually published a while before it even came out as a book. He published it as a series, a little bit at a time through different magazines, and finally came together as a collection. And even then, you can get it in different ways. And so I have, this is Mouse 1. You can see this is the first part of it, and then it ends kind of with a to be continued. There's clearly a lot more to the story here. And then there's Mouse 2, which also is not the end of the story. This is just continuation, and it gets into some of the details of the Holocaust and Auschwitz itself. So if you're not familiar with it, Mouse, and you can see spelled M-A-U-S, and the cover here very clearly has two mice, which are survivors. This is part 1. It's called A Survivor's Tale, and in the background, it's kind of right over the swastika, a kind of cat image of Hitler. And so in the story, they're all humans, technically, but the survivors, the Jews, are mice. They're drawn all as mice, and the Nazis are depicted as cats. Very clear metaphor there, right? So that in itself is unique, and the art style is very distinctive. It's a good book. It's very compelling, and this is one that as soon as I started reading it, it was hard for me to put down. The story itself, of course, is very compelling. And so what this is Art Spiegelman, the author illustrator. It's interesting because it's not just a retelling of what happened in the Holocaust. He wasn't there. This is his father who's going back and kind of reliving his memories, because Art himself is interviewing about this. He sees somebody, he is a comic, and he's wanting to tell the story of what his parents went through. And he does this in a series of flashbacks. It actually begins with him as a mouse and talking to his father as a mouse, and they're talking to each other, and it's him basically having just a regular conversation with his father and asking him to tell him about what happened in Germany all those years ago. And so it's not quite half a half. I'd say part of the book, maybe a third of it is set in what you would consider the present time. It's not actually present anymore, but in his life, his everyday life, going to visit his father, and we see just these everyday interactions between them. And, he doesn't actually depict his father in the most flattering way, and that even is discussed in the book. He references it himself, talking about how he's just kind of annoyed having to visit his father. He does this because he wants to learn about his past, but his father's a very difficult man, and, this comes up over and over again, and a lot more actually in part 2, about how, a lot of times survivors of things like war, like the Holocaust, are kind of just glorified for the fact that they survived and ennobled almost. It made it seem as if they, are these perfect people who had to endure all this. And yes, they had to endure all this, But he makes it clear his father is far from a perfect person. He still has his faults. He's not a happy person every day. He survived, but he's not necessarily always grateful that he did. So this really brings a sense of realism to it. It doesn't make it seem like everything's perfect in their world now because he managed to survive and escape. And so we see the interaction between him and his father, which is actually really in and of itself very interesting, even though there are a lot of mundane things that they go through every day. But again, it's interesting to watch. And also, this is what leads into the series of flashbacks, which gets him to retell the story of what he had to endure. I want to keep reading this, not just because I feel it's historically significant. It's a good book. It's really interesting. For someone who isn't necessarily what you call a history buff, you get to learn a lot. A lot of the details here. It's a very compelling story. Why is this banned? Now, you might think that the fact that these are all graphic novels we're going to discuss, just the term graphic, obviously has double meaning here. These are, some people call comics, they're drawings, right? This is not just words, these are drawings. And so you think, okay, there's a picture of something, graphic, explicit, and that's not it at all, actually. So the reasons mentioned in this Tennessee school district that I talked about earlier, the challenge here from the parents who, you wonder if they've actually read the book. They probably haven't. They skimmed at the very least. But okay, so the main complaint they had was there were, I think, 8 different bad words that were used, inappropriate language. And mind you, this is, I think, for aimed at like a middle school, say middle school kind of curriculum. Regardless of whether those kids have all heard and used those words. Okay, fine. Okay, so not so great words. We're not just blanket banning all books that use naughty words, but it also mentions that there's one picture that depicts a quote unquote nude woman. So a couple of things with this. First of all, it's not a woman, it is a mouse. Okay. And second of all, this mouse drawing picture, it's not drawn in a way that's in any way suggestive or what you might think of. We don't want to expose our children to nude drawings. It's drawn in very, very serious, heavy scene where Art, the author, where his mother commits suicide after having endured everything she did through the Holocaust. And so you have to wonder, what is the connection here between this unclothed mouse drawing and what you would imagine is they have a problem with seeing a nude drawing. Typically, if there's a challenge or a problem with what you say somebody who's unclothed, it might be because it's sexually suggestive in some way. And if you make that connection with this particular depiction in this book, there's something seriously wrong with you. You're trying to find a reason to ban this book. So let's get to what is the real reason that we want to suppress this history. It also has to make you wonder, if this book has been out for this long, why just in the last couple of years, all of a sudden is this problematic? Or should I say, why is it that now just recently it's okay to be against anti-Nazi propaganda? I shouldn't even use the word propaganda. This is factual. This is history. This could go into a whole nother thing, but let's just say this is an excellent book, Mouse. Again, whichever version you get, I suggest getting the whole thing, the big edition. But the fact that this has been challenged and banned, it's not because of the graphic content that's within it. It's because of the fact that this might make some people feel uncomfortable because of the topic, and not the uncomfortableness that you might feel by understanding that the Holocaust happened and all these atrocities were committed. No, it's like the later guilt, the fact that people don't want to admit that it happened. The next book I want to talk about, the next graphic novel that has been challenged, is called Persepolis. Now, this book was published back in 2003, and it was written and illustrated by Marjane Satrapi. Very similar to Mouse, this uses black and white, animation style that is semi-realistic, let's just say. Now, this one doesn't have animals. This is just human characters. And so this is just a way for her to tell her story, and even says there's the subtitle is The Story of a Childhood. And so this is her story. This is like a memoir of growing up, but this is her growing up in Iran. Now, I'll admit I learned a lot reading this book. Again, I like history, and I know, I guess, a little bit about a lot of different topics. I don't know a whole lot, to be honest, about Middle Eastern history. I'm vaguely familiar with some of the revolutions that happened in Iran a long time ago. But this, again, this is her childhood, and this is published about over 20 years ago. And so this is going back to the 70s and the 80s. And so I learned a great deal just from not only what happened, talking about all the events of the revolution, but the inside perspective, because all we know is what we hear from the American version. Now, her purpose in writing this, I just want to read quickly from the introduction here. This old and great civilization has been discussed mostly in connection with fundamentalism, fanaticism, and terrorism. As an Iranian who has lived more than half of my life in Iran, I know that this image is far from the truth. That is why writing Persepolis was so important to me. I believe an entire nation should not be judged by the wrongdoings of a few extremists. So what is it about this graphic novel, Persepolis, that had caused it to be challenged and banned, particularly in school districts? Now, kind of like with Mouse, this book had been around a while, several years, I think almost a decade before its first challenge. And that's because it wasn't an instant bestseller, to say, and probably took a while for it to be picked up on, in terms of school curriculum and as a teaching tool. And so what happened was that this was deemed too violent, right, too explicit, because, I mean, sure, this is a book about the war and revolution, and so it does discuss themes of torture, about how people that she knew, family and friends, were tortured and killed because that's history. That's what happened. I mean, that's when you teach history, especially if you learn about any war, let's say the American Civil War, that's just part of what happened. So to be fair, this isn't completely inaccurate because yes, it does discuss war, and there's one part where it talks about somebody who was cut to pieces. If you look at the actual picture in the comics, there's no way that you could look at this and be instantly horrified by how graphic it is. Not only is it black and white and it's comic and it's not exactly the most realistic drawing style, this is not the reason. Let's just call it what this is. It's Islamophobia. This is a book that actually depicts Muslims and those of Middle Eastern origin in a way that isn't unflattering, and that doesn't sit well with some people. The whole point, as I already mentioned, that she said in the introduction, the author herself, was that this is a way to show that people from Iran or anywhere in the Middle East are not all terrorists, are not extreme, right? Muslim doesn't equal evil. Just like in reality, Christian doesn't always equal pure and holy. There was even one parent who questioned why a book about Muslims was assigned on September 11th. This book was published not very long after 9/11 happened, and it's no coincidence here. Nothing much has changed since then in a lot of people's views of Muslims. And with this book, part one, again, just the beginning, there are several sequels to it. It's an ongoing story, and as always, I'm going to highly recommend it. This was very captivating to me. This book I actually probably read a little bit quicker than Mouse. I don't know why. It was just, I think the story itself just seemed a little bit more compelling. It didn't go back and forth as much as Mouse did. But I mean, the topic maybe isn't quite as heavy either, although it is definitely still serious in a lot of parts. But this should be used as a teaching tool, especially at the appropriate grade levels. We're talking about high school, right? And it's hard for me to read this objectively and then go back and find out that it was banned or challenged and try to put it together without looking for another reason outside of what is stated. There's not a single picture, no words, there's nothing in here that would make me think this is offensive, right? This shouldn't belong in a school district. All right, but we're gonna have to dig even harder to find a good excuse for this one. So this book is called New Kid by Jerry Craft. No wars, no revolutions, no nothing like that. No violence, no sex, no. This is about a kid who is brand new to his middle school. Jerry Craft, the same author who did Class Act, which is a pretty popular book for, let's say, the middle school age. And so this one, you think, just as popular, easy to read. It's about fitting in, right? That age, that awkward age of adolescence and transitioning. Except one problem, the main character in the story, Jordan Banks, happens to be African American. And the story centers around the fact that not only is going to a new school, but he's going to a new school that happens to be predominantly white. And there are only about 2 or 3 other African Americans who also are at that school. And it actually goes so far as to imply that sometimes black students aren't always welcomed with open arms by their white classmates. No, it doesn't go so far as to have like any racial slurs or hate crimes or anything like that. It's all pretty innocent. It's like teasing, or they somehow continue to get his name wrong, right? There's one student whose name is Marcus, and they call him Malcolm instead. Also, throughout the story, the teachers, who are all white, uh, they seem to stereotype him and what his interests are and what he knows. Just assume that he loves basketball. Assume that he wants to read stories about Black heroes and people who are growing up and making themselves something out of living in the streets. Not that he would be interested in fantasy or any other type of book, or anything that the other students would be interested in. And this is all very, very stereotyped. And so this book is basically it's kind of a right back at you. So he kind of stereotypes the white students and teachers into how they act and behave, and saying like, hey, this is what you do to me, and showing them this is my perspective. This is how you make me feel when you say these things, when you act this way. And so the point of the story is to empathize with someone who is different from you. And instead, what that did was it created challenges from people who don't want to empathize with others. So with this book, there was no image, no word, no anything that you could point to and say, this is offensive, this doesn't belong, my children shouldn't read this. They just came out with it and said, this promotes critical race theory. In other words, this story might make white people uncomfortable because it shows those microaggressions, things that I mentioned about, things that aren't, I guess you would consider, or at least if you're the one doing it, you wouldn't consider explicitly or overtly racist, but they are in subtle ways, maybe even a subconscious way. And from the beginning, it also shows, quote unquote, white privilege. And yes, it does. And that's the point. So are we to pretend those things don't exist, that they don't happen? I guess so. That's what somebody who would challenge this book would want you to think is just don't worry about it. These things don't exist, or if they do, you shouldn't be offended by it. One recurrent theme here as well that Jordan, the main character, has to deal with is code switching, which is something I've mentioned previously in All Boys Aren't Blue, and this happens a lot of times in the African American community. It's something you just would not be able to understand if you didn't have to experience it yourself. And if you can't experience it yourself because you don't have to, then you do this by reading about the experience of other people. But again, if it makes you uncomfortable, maybe try to understand why and what you're going to do to change that situation and make it better, instead of just pushing to the side and ignoring it. Now, as far as book banning in general and deciding what's appropriate and what's not, Jerry Craft, the author himself, said, I'm a parent. I do think as a parent, you have every right to decide what your kid can and cannot read, but you don't have the right to tell me what my kid can read. Exactly right. That's basically the answer to all of these stories. If you don't like it, you don't have to read it, and you don't have to allow your child to read it, but you don't get to decide what other people can or should read. Now, these are far from the only books that touch on these particular topics, but it's interesting that despite the fact that a lot of what's presented is far less, let's say, offensive, if you could even be offended by it, than some of these other books that talk on the same topics. These graphic novels, the fact that they are pictorial, I think maybe these stand out more to certain people. It's no surprise that in 2024, the number 2 most banned book of all was a graphic novel, and that's Gender Queer. That's a book that you probably don't even need to know what it says inside. It could just be a cover with a title and just a bunch of blank pages inside. That book would get challenged and banned, right? Just because of the title. All right, I get that. These books cover history, right? Things that students need to learn about. And there's no reason that these books should be off shelves just because it makes a few people, a small minority of people, uncomfortable, and they don't want anybody to read about it. But hey, that's basically the story for all of these banned books. And don't worry, I'll be going over a lot more to talk about why they should be read, need to be read. I hope you consider reading those books, Mouse, Persepolis, and New Kid. I also appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.